The low sun bled a final, watery gold over the high peaks of the Sierras, painting the vast, silent expanse of snow in a momentary, deceptive warmth. It was the kind of beauty that could only be found in the crucible of absolute cold, a cruel and perfect work of indifference. A thin, cold wind, carrying the scent of pine sap and the distant, metallic tang of coming iron, whistled through the wagon canvas, a sound like a mother's desolate lament. Inside the canvas womb, under a canopy, patched with rawhide and stitched with frozen fingers, a small girl named Alara traced the splintered raw grain of the wagon floor. Her small hand, chapped and blue with cold, was caked with the fine red dust of a desert long past, a memory of a time when the sun was a friend, and the ground was not a mirror of the sky. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed wool and the faint, bitter smell of boiling leather, the last remnants of a harness, now being rendered for a broth that tasted of nothing but desperation. It was a flavor that had replaced all others, the taste of a hunger that had become a companion, a constant, low-burning fire in the pit of her stomach. Her mother, her face a mask of exhaustion and silent prayer, held a rusted iron key in her palm. The key was a heavy, meaningless object from the life they had left behind, a polished piece of metal that had once opened the door to their home. Now it was a dead weight, a cold lie against her skin. It was a relic from a world that had forgotten them, a world of locked doors and warm fires, of overflowing larders and the sound of laughter. Alara looked up, her breath a white plume in the dim, cold light. She saw not her mother's face, but the ghost of a smile she once knew, before the mountain had claimed it, before the winter had etched its brutal story onto her bones. Her mother's lips moved, but no sound came. Only the low, moaning whistle of the wind answered her silent words. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow, a suffocating blanket of unsaid fears and unspoken griefs. A silence so profound it was its own kind of prayer. It was the silence of a world where hope had become a luxury, where even a whisper felt like a violation. This silence was the true face of the mountain, not the blinding white or the treacherous ice, but the sound of nothingness. Memory was a cruel and beautiful thing. Alara's mother, her name was Adeline, and she could still feel the warmth of the sun on her back as she stood by her kitchen window, the scent of fresh-baked bread a sweet, cloying cloud. She could hear her husband's laugh, a sound like a warm fire crackling. They had come here on a promise, a whisper of a new world, a place where the land was fertile and the skies were endless. They had sold everything, the spinning wheel, the old wooden cradle, even her father's pocket watch, for a wagon and a dream. They had locked the door and held the key, a final, hopeful gesture. They had called it a journey. Now it felt like a slow, inexorable burial. The canvas walls of the wagon, once a symbol of their journey, were now the walls of their prison. Each day was a small death, a tiny, incremental starvation of body and spirit. The cold was an entity, a living, breathing thing that gnawed at their fingers and toes, a constant, aching presence. The sight of their own breath in the air was a constant, haunting reminder of how fragile they were. It was a silent conversation with the world. We are still here, still clinging to this life. The girl, her face gaunt, her eyes too large for her face, reached out a hand and touched the rusted key in her mother's palm. The cold metal transferred to her own hand, a shock that felt strangely familiar. It was the cold of a forgotten life, the cold of a door that would never open again. Adeline looked at her daughter's face and saw her own reflection, but it was a reflection warped by hunger and despair. She saw the girl she used to be, full of easy laughter and simple dreams. The thought was a dagger to her heart. She had led her here. She had watched her daughter's girlhood wither under the brutal gaze of the winter, her innocence exchanged for the heavy, knowing gaze of a survivor. The mother and daughter were not just lost in the mountains. They were lost in a chasm of time, suspended between the life they had loved and a future that did not exist. Every breath was a small effort, a defiance of the cold and the hunger, a silent scream into the endless void. The wind howled outside, a sound like a distant, ravenous beast. It was not just the mountain they were battling, but the vast, indifferent emptiness that stretched beneath the infinite sky. The key, once a symbol of the home they had locked, was a dead weight, a cold lie against her skin. But now as she looked at her daughter's face, something shifted. It was no longer a symbol of loss, but of what was left. They still had a door to open. The question was, what would be waiting on the other side? They had been abandoned, left to starve, yet their hearts still beat, a small, defiant drum against the mountain's silence. She looked down at the key, cold and heavy in her palm, and for the first time, she did not feel its weight as a burden. It was a promise, a solid, tangible object that had survived the journey. It was a secret to be carried forward, a secret that would one day turn a lock. A single, frosted breath ghosted over a pane of ice, a fragile, momentary stain on the unforgiving clarity of the cold. On the other side, a man, his face a map of frozen despair, pressed his cheek to the rough-hewn pine of the cabin wall, the wood splintered and hard like a broken promise. His name was Elias, and the mountain had stolen the easy rhythms of his life, the satisfying thud of an axe against solid wood, the rich, earthy scent of freshly turned soil. Those were the sounds and smells of a life with purpose, a life he had left behind for the promise of something more. Now, his days were measured not by the sun, but by the dwindling stock of pine needles and bark he gathered for the smoldering fire. The air, thin and sharp as a blade, was filled with the acrid scent of their burning. A poor substitute for the roaring flames of home, a thin whisper of smoke that felt less like heat and more like a final, desperate sigh. He remembered the vast golden prairie, a sea of grass that rippled in the wind, and the steady creak of the wagon wheels as they made their slow, determined journey. The oxen, their great shoulders straining against the leather yokes, had been more than beasts of burden. They were the engines of their dream, their strength a visible, tangible measure of their progress. He could still feel the weight of the reins in his hands, the pull of the harness, a sensation of control and direction. But the mountain had been a wall of ice and rock, a final, insurmountable barrier that had devoured their animals, their supplies, and their hope. In a dark corner of the cabin, a worn leather bridle hung from a nail, a cruel joke, a memory of oxen now long gone, their bones scattered under the relentless white shroud of the snow. Elias ran a skeletal hand over the hard, brittle leather, a gesture of mourning. It was a relic from a lost world, a testament to a strength that had failed. Every day, the ache in his joints was a record of the journey, of the miles that had betrayed them, of the grand delusion that had led them to this frozen hell. He was a man carved from regret, his strength a spent fuel. The wind howled outside, a sound like a distant, ravenous beast. And he knew it was not just the mountain they were battling. It was the vast, but indifferent emptiness that stretched beneath the infinite sky. The terrible loneliness of being utterly, completely alone in a world that did not know his name, a world that cared nothing for his journey or his despair. The days blurred into a seamless tapestry of cold and silence. The hunger was a constant, low-burning pain, a dull ache that occupied his every thought, a reminder that his body was slowly, meticulously betraying him. His memories of food were more vivid than any dream. The taste of a ripe apple, the crunch of a fried potato, the warmth of a stew thick with meat and vegetables. These memories were a torture, a cruel ghost of a life that felt like a fantasy, a story told to a child. The only sound left in the world was the hollow ringing in his ears, a tinnitus born of silence and starvation, a constant, high-pitched hum that filled the space between his thoughts. It was the sound of a world with no future, a world where the only thing left was the echo of a life already lost. He would sometimes whisper his family's names, a dry, rasping sound in the frozen air. But their names, once so full of life and meaning, now felt like hollow sounds, like stones dropped into an empty well. The names of his wife, of his children, were a litany of ghosts. He had failed them. He had promised them a new life, a home where the sun was always warm and the land was always generous. Instead, he had led them to this final, desolate place. The guilt was a heavier weight than any saddlebag, a suffocating blanket that no fire could ever dispel. He would close his eyes and see their faces, their hopeful smiles from the early days of the journey, and the memory would feel like a betrayal. The worn leather bridle in his hands felt like a tangible representation of all he had lost. He had unbuckled it for the last time, the sound of the metal clasp, a final note in a dirge he was still living. The oxen, the gentle giants that had pulled their world across a continent, had given up their lives to give them a few more days, a few more feet. Their sacrifice was a debt he could never repay. He had been a man of action, of sweat and calloused hands, of simple faith in the work of a man. But the mountain had rendered all of that meaningless. The wilderness was not a thing to be tamed. It was an ancient, patient force, and it was watching them, waiting. As the pale moonlight filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, Elias lay down, the frozen ground beneath him a hard, unforgiving mattress. He looked up at the crude ceiling, a patchwork of salvaged wood and frozen earth, and felt a profound, suffocating sense of loneliness. He was a man utterly alone, not just in this cabin, but in the universe. The land did not know his name. The stars did not care about his story. He was a small, fragile life, fighting a war against an enemy that did not even know he existed. The wind howled again, a long, drawn-out cry that was both the sound of a living thing and the sound of nothingness. And in that hollow, empty space, Elias finally understood. The real battle was not against the cold or the hunger. It was against the vast, indifferent silence of a world that had abandoned them and the terrifying realization that they were the last ones left to bear witness. The lantern light, a weak yellow eye in the encroaching gloom, danced over a small tin cup, its surface scarred and dented from a journey that had long since devoured its purpose. This cup, once used to scoop clean water from a running stream, was now a vessel for boiled leather and bone dust broth, a testament to a descent into a desperation so profound it had become a new kind of existence. The woman, her hands trembling, gripped a length of fraying rope, her knuckles white against the dark fibers. The rope was a lifeline that had once bound their worldly possessions, but now felt like a noose, a tangible link to a life of plenty. A life where ropes were for lifting, not for clinging to. The smell of the smoke from their meager fire, a thin, bitter coil in the cold air, was a constant reminder of how little they had left, of a fire that was a fragile, dying ember against the suffocating cold. The cabin, a dark mouth in the relentless winter, was a mausoleum of broken promises. They had come here seeking a new life, a place of abundance, but the mountain had turned their dream into a cage, and the winter had sealed the door shut. The silence was punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic scraping of a blade against a piece of hide, a small sound that felt like the chipping away of their very souls. A small child, his face pale and drawn, coughed, a dry, rattling sound that tore at the heart of the mother. It was a sound that had become a familiar omen, a grim bell tolling the slow, relentless erosion of hope. She knew, with the cold certainty of a life lived on the brink, that this sound was the beginning of the end. Her gaze fell back to the rope, the fibers unraveling like her own sanity. She remembered her wedding day, the intricate knots of her veil, a symbol of a life beautifully bound. Now, all that was left was this crude, fraying line, a measure of her descent into the primal. She thought of the stories of travelers lost in the mountains, of families who had vanished without a trace, and wondered if this was their fate as well, to be nothing but a ghost in the vast, silent snows. The cold was a constant ache in her bones, a weight that pressed down on her spirit, threatening to break her. But the child's cough was a new sound, a different kind of pain, and it was a force more powerful than any blizzard. Each day was a slow, agonizing process of survival. She would gnaw at the leathery scraps, trying to find some sustenance, some small measure of energy to keep the cold at bay. The scraping of the blade against the hide was a meditation, a ritual of desperation. It was a sound that told the story of their fall from grace, from a life of abundance to a life of scavenging. The smell of the fire, a thin, acrid scent of pitch and pine, was a poor substitute for the roaring fires of home, for the warmth that once filled her life. She would close her eyes and try to conjure the smell of her husband's hands, of wood smoke and clean linen, but the images were fleeting, fragile things, easily lost to the hunger and the cold. The child coughed again, a sound that felt like a blow. The mother, her name was Eleanor, and she felt the terrible weight of her responsibility. Her husband was gone, vanished in a desperate attempt to find help, and now she was alone with her son. She had to be strong, had to be a fortress against the storm. She looked at the fraying rope in her hand and saw not a tool, but a symbol of the thin line that separated her from the unforgiving abyss. Every breath she took, every small, desperate act of survival felt like a defiance of the inevitable. She was holding on by a single thread, a knot of desperation and love that was all she had left. The cabin, with its low ceiling and its suffocating gloom, was a tomb. But it was their tomb, a small, dark sanctuary against the endless white. Outside, the world was a canvas of desolation, a vast and indifferent expanse of snow and ice. But inside, there was still a spark of life, a small, fragile flame that refused to be extinguished. The silence, once a source of terror, was now a kind of solace, broken only by the sound of her breath and the sound of her son's. It was a silence that told her they were still here, still fighting. As the lantern flickered, casting long dancing shadows on the walls, Eleanor looked at her son's small, sleeping form. He was so fragile, so vulnerable, and yet he was the reason she kept fighting. She looked at the rope in her hand, the single, fraying thread that was all that stood between them and the abyss. And she saw not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new one. It was a story of a mother's love, of a desperate, primal will to survive. The rope was not a symbol of her defeat, but a testament to her strength. It was a final desperate knot, a promise that she would not let go. Not yet. The moon hung like a broken silver coin in the icy sky, a cold and distant eye observing the desolation below. It cast long, skeletal shadows across the endless white, painting the unforgiving snowscape in shades of blue and gray. A young woman named Sarah knelt, her gloved fingers numb against the frozen earth, and scraped at the hard, cracked surface. She was searching for anything, a stray root, a frozen turnip, a remnant of the life that had once passed through this land. The only sound was the hollow crunch of her boots on the hard snow, a lonely, rhythmic beat in the vast silence. The scent of wood smoke, a ghost-like presence in the frozen air, lingered on her wool cloak, a memory of a warm hearth she could no longer feel. The frost on her eyelashes was like a fine veil, blurring the landscape into a desolate, white abstraction, a screen between her reality and a dream she could barely remember. She thought of the woven basket at her side, an object of humble beauty she had carried for 1,000 miles, now empty and useless. It was a container meant for apples and wild berries, a promise of a harvest that never came. She had filled it once, long ago, with the hope of a bountiful future. Now, it was a hollow shell, a monument to a beautiful, terrible lie. Sarah looked up at the moon and felt a profound, suffocating sense of invisibility, as if the world had moved on without her. She was a silent spectator in her own slow demise. Her sacrifice was not a grand, heroic act, but a slow, quiet surrender of her vitality, a quiet death by 1,000 tiny starvations. She remembered her mother's hands, busy with a spindle, weaving a future from wool, her fingers moving with a familiar grace and purpose. Now Sarah's own hands were too stiff and cracked to grasp even the memory of a needle. The very act of holding them up to the cold sky felt like a great and terrible effort. She had been a girl of simple joys, the feeling of sun-warmed earth on her bare feet, the sound of her father whistling a tune as he worked, the taste of clean, sweet water from a wooden bucket. These were not just memories. They were a form of torture, a constant, mocking reminder of all that had been lost. The sky, once a canvas of limitless promise, was now a cold, indifferent expanse, a lid sealing their fate. It offered no solace, no hope, only a relentless, brilliant coldness. The wind, a biting knife that cut through her thin clothing, whispered only one word: surrender. But she could not yet. She kept scraping, her fingers raw, her body shaking with cold. The hunger was a relentless beast, a gnawing ache in her gut that had become the defining sensation of her existence. It had replaced joy, grief, and fear with a single brutal imperative: survive. She had to find something. The family, huddled in the makeshift lean-to behind her, depended on her. Their survival was a burden she carried as heavily as the cold. The innocence she had once possessed was now a ghost, replaced by a grim, fierce determination. Her mother had always told her stories of the land, of its generosity, of the cycles of planting and harvest. Sarah had believed in the earth's promise, but this place had no promises. It was a place of broken things. It was a place where stories ended. Her mind, once filled with the dreams of a new home, was now a simple, primitive machine dedicated to a single task. There was no room for poetry, no space for memory, only the brutal, singular need to find something, anything, to keep the hunger at bay. Her gloved fingers, now bare at the tips, brushed against something hard beneath the frozen ground. She dug with a fierce, frantic energy, a small flicker of something like hope igniting in her chest. She pulled it from the earth, and in the pale moonlight, she saw it was a rusted horseshoe. It was a symbol of a journey that had thrown its luck to the wind and landed in this frozen hell. It was an object of immense irony, a monument to the very thing they had lost. Sarah held the rusted horseshoe, its cold weight a shock in her palm. It was a small, brutal truth in a world of beautiful lies. She had come here seeking fortune, and all she had found was the cold reality of a lost gamble. The horseshoe was a silent testament to the vast, indifferent wilderness that did not care about luck or promises or hope. It was a symbol of the trail, not as a path to a new life, but as a monument to those who had fallen. The sound of her quiet sobbing was lost in the wind, a small, insignificant sound against the vast, silent cold. She was alone, surrounded by the remnants of those who had failed before her. And the horseshoe was a final, terrible gift, a reminder that in this brutal world, all that was left was the truth of the iron. And the iron was cold. The scent of stale biscuit crumbs and wet wool hung in the air of the crude lean-to, a suffocating mixture of memory and decay. It was a smell that told the story of what had been and what was left. Huddled against the cold, a boy named Thomas, no older than 10, sat hunched over a small carved wooden bird. Its wings were chipped and its painted eyes faded, a small sad relic from the easy days of the trail. The bird had once been a symbol of flight and freedom, a whimsical promise of the lands they would one day soar over. Now, in the dark, silent lean-to, it was a cruel joke, a mockery of their immobility. He ran his thumb over the smooth, worn wood, a futile gesture against the crushing reality of their imprisonment. His father's worn, calloused hand rested on his shoulder, a heavy weight of both comfort and guilt. The boy knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with words, that this hand, once so strong and sure, was now as fragile as his own. He could smell the faint, coppery scent of the blood his father had spat up just that morning, a dark secret that hung in the air between them, unspoken and terrifying. It was a scent that had replaced the smell of clean earth and fresh grass. It was the scent of a slow, quiet end. The wind outside, a long, mournful cry, was a constant presence, a song of sorrow that burrowed into his bones. It was a sound that had become his only companion, filling the hollow space where his father's stories used to be. Thomas thought of the tales his father used to tell, of the gold and green of California, of a land where the sun always shone and the rivers ran with clear, cold water. He had painted a picture of a world so beautiful it felt like a dream. But now, that world seemed as distant as the stars, a mythical land that had no place for them. He looked down at the wooden bird, its wings unable to stir, and a profound, chilling truth settled over him. The theme of exile, once an abstract concept from a book his mother used to read, was now a physical state. They were exiles not just from their old home, but from the very idea of a future. They were trapped between a life they could not return to and a dream they could not reach, marooned on a frozen island in an ocean of snow. The silence that followed was broken only by the boy's quiet, racking sobs, a sound that felt like the final, splintering crack of a hope long frozen solid. It was a sound his father could not bear. He had always been the strong one, the leader, the man who had promised a better life. But the mountain had rendered him powerless. He had watched his oxen die, had seen the life drain from them, and with it, the life from his own soul. The burden of his guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on him, a constant, aching pain that was deeper than the hunger. He had made a promise to his wife, a promise that now felt like a lie. He had brought them here, and he could not get them out. The silence between them was a testament to his failure, a silent conversation about all the things he had left unsaid. The father's mind was a maelstrom of regret and terror. He had seen the way the mountain had swallowed other families, leaving no trace behind but a broken wagon wheel or a discarded blanket. He knew that their journey had become a slow, agonizing descent into nothingness. The wooden bird, a relic of a life filled with simple joys, was now a brutal symbol of their captivity. It was a reminder that freedom was a concept, not a reality, a thing that could be taken from you with the coming of the snow. He wanted to tell his son that it would be all right, that they would survive. But the words died in his throat, replaced by the bitter, coppery taste of his own blood. He had promised him freedom, but he had given him a cage. He had promised him a future, but all they had was this terrible, indefinite present. The boy's sobs were a mirror of his own inner turmoil, a public display of a grief he had kept private. It was the sound of a heart breaking, a sound that was more terrifying than the howl of the wind. It was the sound of a child giving up hope, and in that sound, the father felt his own strength give way. He had nothing left to give, nothing left to offer. He looked down at his son, his body shaking with silent sobs, and felt the weight of a truth he had tried to ignore. They were not fighting a mountain. They were fighting the vast, indifferent emptiness of the world. They were alone. The wooden bird lay in the boy's hand, a small, still thing. Its wings were broken and it would never fly. And in that moment, the father knew with a terrible, soul-crushing certainty that their hope was broken too. He had led them here, and now he had to find a way to get them out. He had to become a force stronger than the wind, stronger than the mountain, stronger than his own despair. A heavy iron bell, salvaged from an abandoned wagon and now silent, lay half buried in the snow, a grim sentinel standing watch over the frozen, forgotten world. It had been meant for celebration, for the summoning of the evening meal, to mark the end of a day of honest travel with a joyous clang. Now it was only a lump of cold metal, its clapper gone, its voice vanished into the wind. The man, a gaunt shadow of his former self, knelt and touched its frozen surface. Its coldness was an extension of his own, a temperature that had seeped into his very soul. He was a pioneer named Jeremiah, and the bell was a symbol of all the rituals the winter had consumed, all the rhythms it had destroyed. The daily act of ringing the dinner bell had been a kind of faith, a belief in the land's bounty, in the promise of the journey. But that faith had been broken, its pieces scattered like the dust they had once walked through. Jeremiah remembered the clatter of plates, the scent of fresh-baked bread, a smell so real it ached in his memory, and contrasted it with the thin, hungry air they now breathed. He remembered the lowing of the cattle, the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels, the familiar thud of an axe on firewood. These were the sounds of a lost world, a world of forward motion and shared purpose. The only sound left was the quiet, constant hiss of the snow falling, a soft, relentless sound that was the sound of a world being erased. The bell, a testament to a faith now lost, was his only companion in this profound silence. He knelt beside it, and in the vast, indifferent quiet of the mountains, he felt the heavy weight of his guilt. He had led them here. He had chosen this path. He had seen the sign that warned them of the coming winter, the whispers that spoke of the dangerous pass, and he had dismissed them as the fears of lesser men. His pride had been a compass, and it had led them to this dead end. The bell was not just a symbol of loss, it was a monument to his mistake. Every cold wind that whipped past him, every pang of hunger that gnawed at his gut, was a direct consequence of his arrogance. The frozen, silent wilderness was a reflection of the cold, silent truth in his heart. He was a man who had built his life on certainty, on the unshakable belief in his own strength and judgment. But the mountain had stripped all of that away, leaving him with nothing but his failure. He was a shepherd who had led his flock to slaughter, and the shame of it was a crushing weight. He had promised his family a future of prosperity and ease. He had painted a picture of a homestead with a field of gold, of a life free from the constraints of the old world. But his dreams had become a mirage, and his promises had turned to dust. He looked at his hands, once so strong and capable, now skeletal and weak. They were the hands of a man who had failed to provide. The cold was a physical torment, but the guilt was a spiritual one, a slow, agonizing process of self-immolation. He had brought them here, and he had to be the one to get them out, to fix the monumental wrong he had committed. The wind picked up, a mournful cry that sounded like the voices of the lost. He thought of his wife, her face etched with a silent sorrow, of his children, their eyes too wide with a terror they could not name. He had tried to be a source of strength, a rock in the storm. But he was just a man, and the mountain was an ancient, patient force, a god of indifference that demanded a sacrifice. The bell, half buried in the snow, felt like an offering. It was a cold, iron symbol of a life that had been given up, a monument to a story that was ending in tragedy. Jeremiah ran a thumb over the bell's frozen surface, its coldness a stark reminder of the cost of his choices. He had believed in a journey, but the mountain had turned it into a punishment. The snow continued to fall, a soft hiss that was the sound of a world being buried, a final, beautiful silence. He was all that was left of a grand dream, and the bell was his silent companion. He had to find a way to honor the bell's silence, to turn this final, grim chapter into something more than just a burial. He had to find a way to make it a beginning. He looked at the bell, a frozen monument to his failure, and for the first time he felt not just guilt, but a terrifying, grim purpose. He had to become something more than just a man who had led them here. He had to become the man who would find a way out. A single, tattered blanket, its wool thin and worn, lay discarded in the snow, a faded memory of a family that had once huddled beneath its warmth. The wind, a biting, relentless presence, tugged at its loose threads, a sound like a whisper of a forgotten story, a final, fragile sigh. A woman, her face pale and drawn, stumbled through the blinding white expanse, her vision blurred by tears and the glare of the sun on the snow. She clutched a small, chipped ceramic doll, its painted smile a grotesque mockery of her own despair. The doll, a gift to her daughter, was now a small, cold monument to her absence, a weight in her hand that was heavier than any stone. The air was so dry it cracked the skin on her lips, and the only scent was the sharp, metallic tang of the frost, a scent of a world without life or warmth. She had lost the smell of her daughter's hair, of the warm, buttery scent of her skin. She had only this, the smell of her own slow war, quiet death. She thought of her daughter's laughter, a sound as fragile and as beautiful as the glass bells her mother used to hang on the porch back home. The sound of that laughter, once the music of her world, was now a phantom sound, a ghost that haunted her waking hours. The wind carried a sound now, not a whisper, but a cry. It was not a real cry, but a memory, a ghost of her daughter's last breath, a sound that she had heard and would never be able to forget. The girlhood she had so fiercely protected was now just a memory, a lost innocence left behind in the snow, like the tattered blanket. Her duty, once to protect her family, had now been reduced to the grim task of survival, a duty she felt was a kind of betrayal. Every step she took away from the blanket, away from the last place she had seen her daughter, felt like a sin. She was a mother who had outlived her child, and the world had no language for that kind of grief. She was a ghost walking in a world of blinding light, a world that was oblivious to her pain. She fell to her knees, the cold seeping through her worn boots, a final, brutal truth. She was a woman anchored to the earth, to the memory of her daughter, while the world moved on, indifferent to her pain. The snow was a vast, indifferent ocean, and she was a ship without a sail, without a purpose. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears in the blinding sun, and saw a bird, a small, dark shape, take flight from a high branch. The bird, a symbol of freedom and escape, was a terrible, beautiful thing. It was a sign of a world that was alive, a world that was free, a world that she could no longer be a part of. The bird was soaring, and she was on her knees, a prisoner of her own grief. The hunger was a constant, gnawing presence, but the grief was a greater one. It had become a physical thing, a weight in her chest, a phantom limb that ached with the memory of a touch she would never feel again. The ceramic doll in her hands was all that was left of a life that had once been so full of laughter and joy. She ran her thumb over the doll's chipped surface, a small, futile act of devotion. She had not been able to save her, but she could carry her memory, a burden as heavy and as sacred as a sacrament. She was not a survivor. She was a witness to a tragedy that had devoured her world, a witness to the profound indifference of the mountain, a witness to the slow, quiet, inevitable end of a dream. The wind howled, a sound that was both a lament and a celebration, a sound that was the voice of the mountain itself. She looked back at the discarded blanket, a small, dark stain on the endless white. And she knew that one day, she too would be a small, dark stain on this vast and indifferent world. The bird, now a tiny speck in the endless sky, was a terrible, beautiful reminder of all that she had lost. She was a woman anchored to the earth, to the memory of her daughter, while the world moved on, indifferent to her pain. She was the last one left, and she would have to carry this grief, this guilt, this terrible, beautiful, awful memory for as long as she could. She rose, her body aching, her heart heavy. She did not know where she was going. There was no destination left, no home to find, no family to return to. All that was left was the journey itself, a slow, agonizing pilgrimage through the snow. She looked at the bird, a tiny speck of freedom in a world of captivity, and knew that she could not follow it. She could only walk, a silent, solitary figure, a testament to a loss that was too great to be borne, and a testament to a love that was too strong to be forgotten. The silence of the snow was the only sound left, and in that silence, she walked, a living ghost in a dead world.